think Paul introduced an interesting concept that there are aspects of our ecosystem that are having conversations. I hadn't really thought about it that way before. I think the next two speakers are going to put more emphasis on that the aquatic and the terrestrial systems are having conversations, and that's going to be brought to you by Gordy Reeves. He's an emeritus scientist was with the PNW Research Station, and Dee Olson, who's a research ecologist also with the research station. So they're going to be talking about that conversation and how the aquatic and the terrestrial are all connected. So please help me welcome Gordy Reeves.
Do we see which one of those?
It should be the
Hesburger landscape by Gordy Reeves. There you go.
Okay, thanks. I just want to point out a couple of things. Cheryl mentioned that I work for the PNW. I'm retired. And actually, the work I'm going to present is work that I'm doing under the guise of OSU. I have an appointment in the College of Forestry, and I'm helping them out with the potential development of a research forest down on the Elliott State Forest near Creek Bay. And what I want to do is talk to you about some ideas we've developed. We developed starting back in the science synthesis that Paul talked about, and we're trying to bring them more to a fruition in the Elliott. So, okay, which button am I going forward and which one is backwards here?
So is this little forward button? Yep.
Okay. One of the challenges we faced is integrating the terrestrial and the aquatics. And, we don't, first of all, I want to really commend Cheryl for talking about this, because this is a topic that, even though it's out there, we very seldom really delve into it, and how do we do it. So what I want to do is just show you some ideas here, and I'm going to start off talking about riparian and then integrate that into bringing in the wildlife component. Okay, when we think about the aquatic component, generally built around the riparian areas, and how do we manage riparian areas in terms of the size, and generally the size and the extent of them. Paul mentioned the 25-year synthesis that we just completed, and both Pauls mentioned it. One of the interesting aspects of that was to go back and look at this graph. This was the cornerstone of option 9 when we originally developed it. And this was put together by the scientists that work involved with FEMAT. And the idea here is looking at the various ecological processes and where they occur within the distance from the stream. This was very controversial when we developed it almost 30 years ago. It was challenged quite extensively, particularly by the industry, because remember we ended up going to a riparian area that was equal to a site potential tree height, which in some cases was 250 to 300 feet, and that really. In fact, there were 2 tree heights along the fish-bearing stream, so it's quite controversial. So one of the things I want to point out is that we spent a lot of time in the synthesis looking at this curve. And it turned out that, for a bunch of dummies who sat in the pink tower and were forced to do something, this turned out to be pretty good. It actually looked like there's quite a bit of support. So what we've done in trying to move forward with thinking about aquatics is one of the questions we have is, how do we really know how effective we're being when we articulate or develop an aquatic strategy? And so what we've done, and this is Norm Johnson, Deanne Carlson, Dan Miller, and Lee Benda and myself have worked on this, is we're using wood recruitment as a surrogate for the effectiveness of a riparian strategy. And we use this because if you look at the processes that occur the greatest distance from the channel, it's this wood recruitment. So we use this as a proxy for the effectiveness of a riparian strategy. The other component of this is thinking about wood sources. Generally we think about, we look at wood recruitment to channels, and we generally think about it from coming along along the fish-bearing streams, and that there's this chronic input of wood that is what we see in the channel. But the reality is there are two major sources of wood. There's this riparian, the immediately adjacent riparian areas, as well as the periodic inputs from landslides. Now, the importance of the landslide component varies widely across the landscape. In some places, depending, and it could go back to Karen's maps, and I think it would fit very well, where you got sort of this low connectivity between upslope and the channel. That you can imagine the input of wood is going to be relatively low. But in other cases, it's quite high. It can be 40 or 50% of your wood load is coming in via landslides. It comes in a different way. It's coming in and catastrophically in large amounts, as opposed to just chronically and over time. So we've used this information to develop a way of assessing the potential effectiveness of it. And here's what I'm showing you here is a map where we wanted to get 80% of the potential wood delivery. Okay. Now let me just point out, some people will say, why don't we want 100? If we were to get 100% of the wood delivery in this landscape, it would entail about 90% of the area. Okay. We know, okay, that ideally we want to shoot for 100, but realistically, given all the other competing demands we have on the landscape, we're never going to, we would be essentially locking this area up if we wanted 100%. So what we want to do is show people what you can get at different levels. So this is 80%. If you want to get 80% of your wood, of the wood delivery potential, this is what it would look like. So the dark blue streams, the dark blue are the fish-bearing streams, the lighter ones are the non-fish-bearing streams. And what you see here is this represents about 20% of the area. You say, well, what's the difference? Why do we get this big difference between, if it takes, get to 100%, you have to get about 90%, you get 80%, it takes 20. That last 10% of this wood recruitment entails about 2/3 more area than does 90%, than it does at 90%, because if you look at the shape of the curve, okay? So that's what's happening here. But we can go through and show what that would look like. And this would entail on the fish-bearing streams, 150-foot riparian area, and on the non-fish-bearing streams, about 100 feet. Here's what you would get, about 90. If you wanted to get 90% of your wood, you would end up with roughly 33% of your area in riparian management zones. So you can see that we can show these trade-offs between what we're going to get and where we're going to get it, and let people make changes. Now, the other thing that's interesting is all of these achieve the same goal, okay? Which is roughly 80% wood recruitment. Each of these components achieve 80%. What you want to look at is the fact that the size of the fish-bearing and the non-fish-bearing stream vary widely. Okay, we can achieve the same goals with different configurations on the landscape. And this will be built into some of the things Dee Dee's going to talk about. This is connectivity across the landscape that the non-fish-bearing streams represent. So there's not a single solution. What we have here is you can get the same result with multiple configurations. And then the question is, what do we want to do moving forward? So this is a quick overview. I know this is a lot of information to bear, but believe me, this is how it works. And we're in the process of getting this peer-reviewed and published. Okay, then the question becomes, how do we integrate this with the terrestrial component? So we've been working with the wildlife folks at OSU, looking at the distribution of owls and murrelets in this area. And you see the red, and primarily what you want to see here are these red circles represent active owl pairs, and these are all the murrelet detections. Then we're bringing into play ideas such as intrinsic potential, which again tears into a lot of stuff that Karen was showing with her maps. And intrinsic potential here is either the geomorphic settings that are conducive to providing high-quality habitat for a particular species of fish. In this case, it's coho. And you can see this is in the Coast Range, just east of Coos Bay, down on the Central Coast. Really steep, highly dissected country. Not really that productive in terms of coho habitat. There are a few spots here that are really critical. Other places, if you did this, you would get a very different picture. So what we've done then is identified what we need for owls and murrelets in terms of habitat based on vegetation and other needs. And what we're doing then is partitioning this landscape into areas that are more ecologically important or critical, and other parts that may not, from an ecological perspective, may not be as critical. Now, a lot of people don't like this because what we're doing is we're making some judgment about the the value of different parts of the landscape. And this is not I guess it is in part a judgment. But what we're trying to do is point out is that some places are more important. And I think this has been a theme that we're seeing here about this variation, that there's variation in what goes on within the landscape. And in what we call the conservation emphasis areas, what we would say is one of the things we want to do is reduce the risk, the overall risk, ecological risk that may happen in that part of the landscape. And we're talking about, maybe these are just suggestions now that you could think about. This has not been cast in concrete yet. In these areas, you might manage stands only under 80 years old, very similar to what we do but was suggested in the Northwest Forest Plan, employing ecological forestry or long rotation. So you think what you're trying to do here is reduce the risk to this potential part of the landscape, or ensure some greater level of persistence. In the multiple objective side, we've got these owls, we've got the riparian areas, and we can manage all stands, we can employ ecological forestry, a whole other thing could be done. So you could accommodate this variation in the landscape geared toward an overall level of persistence for these organisms. And then what we're able to do is we lay a riparian system on there. We're trying to get 80% or whatever level of, in this particular case, we are suggesting 70% may be an acceptable goal. And then you can see that you actually make gains when you start to look for the intersection between where owls and murrelet habitat would be with the fish. And you go here, you can see there's about you go from 70% as our original goal, and by including what we would get, building on what we would get from owls and murrelet, it goes up roughly 10% to 77%. So you're starting to look for efficiencies and use these efforts together. Now, let's see. The other thing that is a possibility is not distributing your management activities are equally across the landscape. And in this particular case, one of the things we're suggesting is, well, we could do an overall of 70% efficiency for the riparian conditions, but not do it equally, where we would do 80% in here, and the balance would come out in the multiple objectives area. And you can see that what you're doing is varying the width of the riparian areas here, okay? So not having a one-size-fits-all approach, but trying to accommodate this inherent variability that we see across the landscape. And then also as part of this, and Paul alluded to climate change is going to be a big player, in all of our systems. In this particular piece of ground, in this area, it's not summer temperatures that are going to be the major challenge from climate change. There's certainly going to be some places, some places here where water temperatures are going to reach, some higher levels than we would like. But but one of the other things we can do is look at this landscape and try to understand where riparian areas are really going to make a difference with water temperature. Oftentimes we say, well, you have to have riparian zones everywhere to control water temperature, but the reality is there are other factors. Topographic shading, there is the orientation of the stream and other things that influence water temperature. And what we're showing here, there are a few spots in this landscape, these red areas here, where riparian zone is the primary determinant of water temperature. So we want to make sure, for example, we made sure we had riparian management in those particular cases. The big signal in this country is going to be changes in winter flows, precipitation, okay? What we're seeing is a 10 to 15% projected increase in winter flows. The real challenge, the challenge here is going to be increased landslides, okay? And what we're able to do then is to identify which of the non-fish-bearing streams are going to be the primary sources of wood. And all of these colored ones are ones that are going to be important sources of wood for these streams. These become important, and you'll see with Didi's talk, in terms of forming connectivities and corridors for movement. Now, one of the things you see here are these different colors, and they represent different amounts of wood that you can get from these channels. So all the red ones, if you wanted 20%, this is one way to look at this, if you wanted 20% of your wood from your non-fish-bearing streams, you would focus on the red areas. Or if you wanted 40%, you'd use the red and orange and so on, so you can build this up. But the idea here is these serve multiple purposes. They become a important source of wood in the future. They become a way of dealing with climate change. And then as Didi will talk about, they become important movement corridors across the landscape. So to quickly summarize, we've got to consider larger scales. I think this is a real challenge. We talk about it, but we've seldom done it. We've got to either go big or go home, I think, is where the future lies here. Rather than treat the landscape as uniform, I think one of the themes that's emerged here today is variability. And Karen and Paul both dealt with it, but I think we also need to realize from an ecological perspective there's inherent variability out there, and we need to accommodate that and think about how to deal with it. And then, because of all these competing demands we have, so we talk about, wild fish and wildlife here, but think about it, we have recreation, we've got timber production, we've got a whole host of other things that are being, we're asking this landscape to accommodate. We've got to look for ways to be efficient, look for these overlaps, as we showed with the owls and murrelets. So with that, any questions or comments? I think I've still got a minute or two. Yeah, okay.
Question for Gordy while we pull up?
Gordy?
Yep.
I had a question, just a clarification. Really, when you're talking about the potential wood areas,
Excuse me.
if I made the analogy to food versus kitchen, we're talking about the kitchen, not the food, right?
Right.
Meaning, you're not talking about actual amounts of wood that will go in the system. You're just saying the areas that would have the potential to deliver wood.
Repeat the question, if you would.
70% or 60%, is that correct?
That's right. What we're talking about is the potential delivery of wood to the system, and then, what we're trying to do is make sure we've got enough of that potential that we've captured those other processes, ensuring the temperature, for example, and the temperature process is working, looking at root strength and litter quality. So it's not going. You can calculate how much wood you might get over time, but it's not saying how much wood you're going to have in the channel. It's just giving you some idea about the effectiveness of what you're proposing.
If we go back to the previous presentation, a lot of those areas have changed in terms of density, in terms of conditions. So wouldn't we have to somehow kind of bridge that gap between areas that have the potential to deliver and how they've changed over time?
If you can repeat, summarize the question. Yeah, actually, we're going to have to move on. You guys talk. When we're getting into 3 or 4 part questions, I think I'm going to have to put you on a break to chat.